All right. Welcome, folks. Just making sure I've got my slides up. And I think we look good to go. Ready to kick off day 2 of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. Thank you all for making your way back to Zoom here. My name is Chelsea Ross, and I have the honor to serve as the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. At the Partnership for Strong Communities, we are leaders and partners in affordable housing advocacy. We envision a Connecticut where everyone has a safe, stable home that is affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. We're here for housing justice, equity, and access. The partnership has spent 25 years working to support a shared vision for change that partners are bought into and actively working towards. We're advocates and policy experts. We serve as a trusted source of information to build public will. We build and leverage relationships with and between partners. Our guiding principle is that housing is a human right. At the partnership, we work to impact change with and in support of individuals and families across the housing stability continuum. As a result of our work, fewer families and people should experience being unhoused or unstably housed or living in temporary, unaffordable, or unsafe housing conditions. All families and people in Connecticut should have access to non-time limited housing they can afford that is safe and healthy and in thriving communities. The CAHC features local, state, and national experts that lead conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. We invite you to join the conversation at #CAHC2023 across social. And this morning, we are lucky to welcome several esteemed speakers to kick us off. I'd first like to introduce Juana Matias, who serves as the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Regional Administrator for Region 1, which covers Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maine, and Vermont. Prior to her appointment at HUD, Ms. Matias served as the Chief Operating Officer for Mass Inc., a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy and action think tank and civic news organization. Previously, Matias served as the state representative for the 16th Essex District, the first Latina immigrant elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. During her time at the State House, she secured an impressive 81% increase in local funding for her district and sponsored key legislation that protected immigrant rights, stimulated the production of new affordable housing, promoted access to BIPOC-owned and women-owned businesses, addressed inequalities in public school systems, and expanded opportunities for working-class Americans. Ms. Matias, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning as we kick off the second day of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. See if we can get Ms. Matias on camera and off mute. There you are.
There we are. Good morning.
There you are.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for such a kind and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you all today. I want to start off by thanking the Partnership for Strong Communities and its Executive Director, Chelsea Ross, for organizing this Affordable Housing Conference. I understand that this is the 4th conference, so I commend you for your commitment to regularly bringing together hundreds of people from across the state to hear and share different perspectives and discuss what we can do together to approach the complex problems impacting affordable housing and inclusive community development. Chelsea, is this my time to continue going, or do you?
It's your time. It's your time.
Excellent. Thank you. I also want to thank Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy for all you do to support our HUD programming and prioritizing housing, not just in the state of Connecticut, but across our country. As we all know, housing is the key factor to thriving communities. It is also important to remember that at its core, housing is about people. Housing is critical to people's livelihood and physical and mental health, as well for helping support and strengthen families and build strong, vibrant, and sustainable communities. However, right now, housing in America is in a crisis. It is more expansive than ever before in modern history due to long-standing gap between supply and demand of affordable homes for both renters and homeowners. And archaic zoning and land use policies aren't helping to meet our housing density needs. The Biden-Harris administration and HUD Secretary Fudge are extremely committed to closing this gap and laser focused on the long-term national goal of increasing our nation's supply of affordable homes through building, preservation, and innovation. To give you some real-life examples of what this all means to the state of Connecticut and its citizens, in fiscal year 2023, HUD spent nearly $25 billion across 7 program areas in the state, including nearly $700 million for public housing, with more than $288 million in Section 8 project-based funds, nearly $220 million in community planning and development funding, including $40 million in community development block grants, $18 million for home programs that help support the production of affordable housing, $5 million in our housing trust fund, and an additional $18 million to the state to address unsheltered and rural homelessness. HUD has also been committed to providing resources that are available to communities. So I'd like to highlight a few that I'm sure will be of interest and value to you all. We currently have been promoting our Thriving Communities initiative. It's when HUD is working with a variety of federal partners to provide technical assistance to communities to help local governments ensure housing needs are considered as part of their larger infrastructure investments and plans. This technical assistance can help local governments address pressing housing needs by identifying land for housing development near transportation projects and developing preservation and anti-displacement strategies. Our HUD's Distressed Communities and Persistent Poverty Technical Assistance Program is designed to build the capacity of local governments experiencing economic distress and assisting local governments and their nonprofit partners in alleviating persistent poverty in specific areas. And last but not least, our HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit Program provides funding for direct loans and grants for projects that improve energy or water efficiency, enhance indoor quality or sustainability, implement the use of zero-emission electricity and low-emission building materials for new developments. And one of the other key aspects of our commitments is ensuring that as we are addressing our housing crisis, that we do so with a lens towards equity and inclusion. And we are really committed to ensuring that our communities no longer continue to be segregated. Our Pro Home initiative is facilitating local resources for communities that are willing to look at their exclusionary zoning practices and ensure that they're allowing for multifamily development. This is just a broad overview of how HUD works and what we are hoping to do, not just in Connecticut, but across New England. I believe in the department's mission and feel privileged to help the Biden-Harris administration accomplish its goals to advance housing production and equitable economic development throughout the country. Building America's housing stock is an intersectional challenge, requiring us to use every tool at our disposal and every hand on deck to assemble a housing supply that fits the growing needs of our country. But it's important to remember that HUD is just a part of a very necessary whole community approach to housing, working in tandem with crucial federal, state, and local nonprofit and private sector entities is crucial in being able to assist us in meeting our housing needs. That's why I find this conference, Chelsea, so exciting and invaluable. HUD New England has a very dedicated team in Connecticut. It's led by Suzanne Piacentini, our field office director, who is at your service. Any concerns or needs that our partners in Connecticut have on the ground, please feel free to reach out to Suzanne or I want to thank you for your time. I really look forward to continuing to work together to ensure we are preserving and generating affordable housing and advancing inclusive community development in the great state of Connecticut. Back to you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Juana. You know, the theme of our conference this year is housing as the key to thriving communities. So I love that connection with HUD's current initiative. Thank you so much for dedicating yourself to address the inequities in housing across our region. And we are lucky to have both yours and Secretary Fudge's leadership and support. And as you mentioned, the leadership and dedication of our field office director, Suzanne Piacentini, who's been an incredible partner to us here at the partnership and to so many people in attendance this morning. All right. It's now a distinct honor to welcome a tireless advocate for the residents of Connecticut to the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. Our next speaker has dedicated his career to public service and is a steadfast champion for the fundamental right to safe, affordable housing. Senator Blumenthal was elected to represent Connecticut in the United States Senate in 2010. Smartly, Connecticut chose to re-elect him in 2016 and again in 2022, and he's now serving his third term as our senator. Prior to his service in the Senate, Senator Blumenthal served an unprecedented 5 terms from 1991 to 2011 as Connecticut's Attorney General, fighting for the people of our state against large and powerful special interests. Senator Blumenthal is a member of the Committee on the Judiciary, Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Committee on Armed Services, Committee on Veterans Affairs, and Special Committee on Aging. Throughout his distinguished career, Senator Blumenthal has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to addressing the housing challenges faced by individuals and families in our great state. His advocacy extends beyond legislative chambers, reaching into communities where he has actively worked to understand the nuanced issues surrounding affordable housing. Senator Blumenthal understands that thriving communities are built on the foundation of accessible and affordable homes for all. Welcome, Senator, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us today.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Really honored to be with you and proud of the housing community in Connecticut. One of the best, I would say the best and most active in the country. And I think that this 2-day conference is a sign of it. And my very sincere thanks to the Partnership for Strong Communities and to you, Chelsea, and all of your team for your leadership. You mentioned the committees that I serve on in the United States Senate. And when you think about it, housing really cuts across all of those committees. The Committee on Aging, the Committee on Veterans, our seniors, our veterans, the Committee on Armed Services, housing for our military. And, we repeat commonly that we're in the midst of a housing crisis in Connecticut. It's really a housing crisis for our country. And as we see mortgage rates climbing, as we see the supply of housing inadequate to meet the needs of our country, rents skyrocketing as well, people are having a hard time buying medicine and food and affording places, decent places to live in the strongest, greatest country in the history of the world. And here is a sliver of good news. We have some very strong bipartisan support in the United States Senate in favor of doing something about housing. In fact, we have just passed an appropriations bill, and I'm going to look at some of these numbers, go through them with you, that fully funds the security and dignity of our most vulnerable families when it comes to housing. We passed a housing appropriation bill that includes $70 billion for HUD programs. It's bipartisan, I should emphasize, and it was passed with overwhelming support that provides $31.7 billion for tenant-based rental assistance. That's an increase of $1.5 billion and $15.8 billion for project-based rental assistance. Now, we all know these numbers are inadequate. We're making some progress, but it's baby steps, not big steps that we need. And so we need to continue fighting for more of these appropriations. And even though it passed the Senate by an overwhelming bipartisan majority, the House is another story. In fact, the House actually wants to cut these programs. That is, the Republican fringe right wing in the House wants to cut appropriations for these programs. As you know, we're trying to pass a continuing resolution that would be an extension past November 17th for our federal expenditures, keep the government open, avoid a shutdown, which would be disastrous for housing and for many who are in housing, recipients of Social Security and other government programs that aid people in affordable housing. But as a condition of that continuing resolution, there are some in the House who actually want to cut the housing programs and others that are vital to continuing affordable living for people in the United States. So we have a challenge. It's a political challenge. It's also an educational challenge. Make people more aware, as you are doing through this conference, of the fight we have ahead of us, and make sure that we provide sufficient support that our country can well afford to make sure that every person has decent, affordable housing, that homeless is eliminated as we face the winter. That problem is more and more pressing. And as you know, as we all know, in Connecticut, the Coalition on Affordable Housing has demonstrated this, a spike in homelessness recently. In the limited amount of time I have, let me just mention a couple of other legislative initiatives that I think are important aside from the government appropriations. Fighting homelessness through Services and Housing Act. We all know that homelessness is not caused simply by a lack of physical structures. It's also the kinds of services people need, whether it's counseling, treatment for drug or substance abuse disorder, and support for local governments where it really happens is what this Fighting Homelessness Through Services and Housing Act would do. $1 billion for local initiatives in this area. And we know that local governments are essential to targeting homelessness. Second, Manufactured Tenants Bill of Rights Act. I visited a lot of the mobile and manufactured housing sites across Connecticut where mobile homeowners are literally at risk because they lack the power to resist the owners of the physical property where their homes are sited. Now, more and more these manufactured home sites or parks are owned by mega corporations, national conglomerates that have really unbridled power over the owners, and they abuse and misuse this power. And what our bill does is to assure security for tenants who own their mobile homes, but not the underlying land. We also need to make sure, frankly, and I'm just going to be very blunt here, that the federal government is not complicit in denying people decent, affordable housing. What we saw, for example, at Barber Gardens, at Infill, at Clay Arsenal, in the Hartford area, is absolutely intolerable, deplorable conditions that were not only tolerated, but in a sense condoned by HUD because it was providing millions of dollars in Section 8 funding while ignoring or failing to adequately inspect conditions at these apartments. My office, I personally visited with them, went to bat for them. So did activists and advocates in the community. We rallied together, and through the actions, and I want to credit the community activists and elected officials locally, we put enough pressure on HUD to take enforcement action and ultimately remove the Section 8 owners of this property, remove them from the Section 8 program. So I want to thank HUD for taking that action, even though it was the result of this local activism, and I was really pleased and proud to help support it. HUD has also revised its inspection programs for Section 8 and other federal housing at Branford Manor in Groton. It's a federally assisted apartment complex. I personally visited a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, to see the mold that was tolerated there, really dangerous and unlivable conditions. And HUD did take action, but Congressman Courtney and I have sponsored the Healthy Homes Act, Healthy at Home Act, which will make homes healthier by establishing or requiring stronger standards for inspection, preventing, detecting, and remediating indoor mold, which, as you know, is potentially a source of really very, very dangerous illness on the part of people who may live in mold-infested housing. So I really thank you again for your work, for your partnership. As the name implies, you have been a tremendously important partner in this effort. we in Congress look to you as an organization and to many of the individuals who were on this call participating in the conference. Your advocacy makes an absolutely critical difference, and the Partnership for Strong Communities is indeed an advocate for strong communities, which we need more than ever at this time of division and disagreement in our country. Bringing people together in favor of housing programs and affordable housing is critical to the health of our communities and our country. Thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm going back to unfolding challenges and crises, and hope you'll continue the great work.
Thank you, Senator, for taking the time to speak to us today, and for being a true champion for housing affordability and all the work that you do for the people of Connecticut and the people of the United States. I see some Zoom clapping for you, but know that there's hundreds of people clapping for you right now. So thank you so much for your time, Senator.
Thanks to everyone, and thank you. Take care.
I'm you. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our next distinguished leader, Senator Chris Murphy. He's consistently demonstrated a deep commitment to addressing the critical issue of housing accessibility, recognizing its profound impact on the well-being of Connecticut residents. Senator Murphy has dedicated his career to public service as an advocate for Connecticut families. He's been a strong voice in the Senate, fighting for job creation, affordable health care, education, sensible gun laws, and a forward-looking foreign policy. Prior to his election to the U.S. Senate, Murphy served Connecticut's 5th congressional district for 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. During his time in the House, Murphy worked to improve access to housing for homeless veterans, foster job creation, and advocate for affordable health care for all Americans. Murphy authored the Frank Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act to revitalize housing programs for people with disabilities. The bill was signed into law by the president in 2010. Before getting elected to Congress, Murphy served for 8 years in the Connecticut General Assembly. He could not be with us live this morning, but let's hear the remarks he sent along to share with us.
Hello to all my friends at the Partnership for Strong Communities. This is Chris Murphy, your United States Senator. First of all, so grateful for our partnership. We spent a lot of time over the years working together, back when I was in the state legislature, and now today in the United States Congress. Connecticut's a different place because of your work to build a real bipartisan, cross-political coalition around the issue of combating homelessness, in particular chronic homelessness in Connecticut. I want to be helpful in any way that I can. As you know, with your help, I did 4 housing town halls across the state in 2023. Because this issue just increasingly is maybe the highest volume issue that we hear about in our office in Connecticut. I'll be honest with you, I was a little worried because I normally do town halls in which people can bring up any topic. I get about 50, 75 people if I advertise that town hall a couple days ahead of time. The housing town halls had more people, not less people, even though we were talking about only one topic. That's just a sign of how important this issue is to the future of Connecticut. So I'm going to step up my efforts at the federal level to try to get more federal funding, more tax credits, better policy. But you know, the rubber really hits the road at the state level. And so we got to work together on an amplified state strategy to try to get more state money into housing, but also to try to change these rules, these burdensome rules that stand in the way of us building more affordable housing in the state. So let's work together. Thanks for including me in all of your fantastic events. I always would prefer to be there in person, but if I can't, on this occasion, wanted to just be able to offer you some virtual words of encouragement. Thanks for all the work you do.
All right. Thank you to Senator Murphy for all your support of our work and the work you do on housing at the federal level. I did get a message from a couple people that they couldn't hear the senator's remarks, but I also see folks clapping, which makes me think some people could. So apologies if folks were experiencing the inability to hear. As we mentioned, always the sessions are recorded, and so we can share those recordings with you at another time. All right. So we have some amazing sessions lined up for you again today. In just a minute, we'll hear from our National Housing Roundtable. After lunch, plan to join us for our state legislative roundtable where we will hear from our state leader, Representative Eleni Kavros DeGraw, Senator M.D. Rahman, Senator Marilyn Moore, and Representative Jeff Luxembourg. From 1 to 3 p.m., we have another quality set of breakout sessions lined up for you, from parents leading in housing policy, which is going to be an amazing session, to affordable housing preservation strategies in communities, and everything in between. The conference closes online at 3 p.m., and we're looking forward to many of you joining us for our in-person networking reception. As I mentioned, all sessions will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel post-conference. So if you can't choose between 2 breakout sessions or you missed something, you'll be able to catch up with them later. And of course, none of this is possible without the support of our generous sponsors who make the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference a success and free for you to attend today. I thanked them yesterday, and I'm going to thank them again today. Thanks to our leading sponsor, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. CEO Nandini Trajan and CHAFA have been supportive of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference since its inception, not just through sponsorship, but through delivering and participating in countless sessions. Thank you to Commissioner Mosquera-Bruno and the Department of Housing, whose mission is to ensure that everyone has access to quality housing opportunities throughout the state of Connecticut. Thank you to Wells Fargo, who is committed to building an inclusive, sustainable future for all and championing quality, affordable homes. We're grateful to our champion sponsors who have made a commitment to supporting the CAHC and the work to ensure that everyone has a safe, affordable home. Thank you, Bank of America, J.D. Amelia Associates, M&T Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. A big thank you to our foundation sponsors, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Cohn Resnick, and Trinity Financial for caring about the work that we do and helping make this conference free to attend. Thank you to all of our investors, which made it possible for us to bring you 24 sessions across 2 days. In fact, there are so many, we need 2 slides. Each of our generous sponsors are featured and linked on our website. Head to the conference webpage to learn more about each of their work and how you may partner with them. And if you'd like to support the CAHC or the work of the partnership, you can make a donation using this QR code or on our website. Thank you for your support. Last but not least, it doesn't stop here at the conference. Save the date for our upcoming Intersections of Affordable Housing webinar series. If you just can't get enough time on Zoom, we've got a series lined up for you. The first Wednesday of each month throughout 2024, Partnership will host conversations with advocates and leaders in other sectors to talk about the impact that a lack of safe, affordable housing has on the work that they do. First half of the year will include discussions with partners around land use, fair housing, health equity, food insecurity, and homelessness. Registration will open in December and we'll kick off the series in the new year. And please take a moment to fill out our session surveys. After each session you attend, you'll get a little notification in the top right-hand corner of the Zoom events lobby, right above the lobby chat. It'll only take about 30 seconds and your feedback helps us improve the conference moving forward. You'll also receive a survey that covers the entire conference at the end of the conference. And please take a few minutes to complete that as we look to hosting the Affordable Housing Conference in 2024. With that, let's move to our National Housing Roundtable. We have an impressive group of national experts with us today who will explore key advocacy strategies that Connecticut can employ to influence federal affordable housing policy and resources. They'll also share successful initiatives and programs that have had a deep impact in other parts of the country and how they may be adapted to Connecticut's landscape. It is my pleasure to welcome Kim Johnson, who's the Public Policy Manager at National Low Income Housing Coalition, where she leads the coalition's policy portfolios on appropriations and reentry housing and manages implementation of the coalition's broader policy agenda. Dennis Shea is the Executive Director of the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he leads the work to advance public policies that support broad access to affordable housing. And Deborah Thrope, Deputy Director for the National Housing Law Project. Deborah's work focuses on federal, state, and local policy advocacy to preserve affordable housing and tenants' rights. All right, welcome to Kim and Dennis and Deborah. I'm just making sure that our view here is right. Let's see, make sure I'll put us in gallery mode so I can see everybody's faces. Perfect. I'd love to, I'm gonna just make sure you all can come off mute. I see Dennis, you're off mute. You wanna say hi?
Hi, Chelsea. Great to be here with you.
There we go. Kim and Deborah.
Hi, Chelsea. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. I've learned from Zoom to not start talking until we're sure audio works because you know. So I'd love to start off the conversation with each of you introducing yourselves further if I missed something or I got something wrong from what I offered. And if you could share a few key words or phrases that you would pick to best describe what thriving communities look like to you. And audience, I'm going to want your participation here too. So as our panelists answer, I'm going to drop a link in the chat and ask you to share some keywords or phrases that describe what thriving communities look like to you. So I'll do that in a second. But Deborah, let's start with you.
Great. Thanks so much. So first, thank you, Danielle and Chelsea and the partnership for having me here today. It's been a pleasure working with all of you, and I'm really excited to talk about some of our work at NHLP, the National Housing Law Project. We're a federal policy advocacy organization. We focus on the preservation of affordable housing and tenants' rights. We also administer a field network of about, we're over 2,000 now, legal services attorneys, but also other housing advocates and organizers that work directly in the field representing tenants. And it's that network that informs our federal policy advocacy. So you'll hear me talk today about a lot of the amazing work that members of our network are doing. And we provide technical assistance and training to that network. And so I'm going to echo Senator Blumenthal, and I'm going to say thriving community is healthy. And
Love that. Let's go to Dennis. You're next to my screen. What does thriving communities look like for you?
Well, thank you, Chelsea. And it's again, let me echo Deborah. It's great to be with you and with the partnership, and appreciate this opportunity. For those of you who do not know what the Terwilliger Center is, we were founded 2 years ago as a result of a donation by housing philanthropist Ron Terwilliger. And our basic belief is that housing is foundational. And unfortunately, for too many Americans, access to affordable housing is not available. So we are supporting bipartisan policies, which we can discuss later in the program, that we believe would advance the help meet the housing affordability challenge that we're facing in the United States. The Terwilliger Center is housed within the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guessed it, we're all about bipartisanship. The BPC was created 16 years ago by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Howard Baker on the Republican side, and George Mitchell and Tom Daschle on the Democratic side. So we're a place where people can, from both political parties, or if you're an independent too, can come together and try to forge a set of policies and viewpoints that can make a meaningful difference in the lives of Americans. And our goal is, of course, affordable housing. Thriving communities, what does that mean? I might be a little more, use a few more words than Deborah, if that's okay. Obviously, a thriving community is a community with affordable housing, and that's housing that is affordable to families with a broad range of incomes. It's also important, we believe, at the Terwilliger Center where housing is located. So it's not just affordable housing, but it's housing that's close to job opportunities, transportation, nutritious food. Housing that is safe and of decent quality is essential for a thriving community. And I'd also say that it's essential that a thriving community have housing that is affordable and safe on an intergenerational basis. With our population aging so much, and with so many older Americans wishing to age in place in their homes, it's really important that our homes are suitable for living by older Americans, physically suitable. So that's a big challenge for our country going forward. So those are some of the elements, Chelsea, that I would consider to be essential for a thriving community.
Thanks, Dennis. All right, Kim, you're up.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Chelsea and Danielle, and to the Connecticut Affordable Housing Team for having us. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. In case you haven't heard of us, NLIHC is dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policies that really center people with the lowest incomes to ensure that they have homes that are quality, accessible, and affordable in communities of their choice. And NLIHC achieves that through multiple means. We educate lawmakers and the public about the need for affordable housing, including through some of our seminal research reports, including The Gap and Out of Reach, which I'll be happy to share as follow-up materials. We also mobilize members and supporters around the country with our field team in order to advocate for good housing policy. And we work to shape public opinion about low-income housing issues and to ensure that people have all of the resources they need to thrive. And so in relation to the question about what does it mean to have a thriving community, I think, my colleagues, Deborah and Dennis, really covered a lot of it. The only piece that I would really add to that is ensuring that communities are also equitable. So ensuring that we target resources to communities that have been historically disenfranchised, that have been left out of a lot of the funding streams historically that ensure that communities are safe and have, accessible grocery stores, that ensure that communities are healthy and that housing stock is affordable and of high quality. And so that's the only piece I would add in addition to all the other excellent points that were raised.
Thanks so much, Kim, and thanks to our audience. I'm watching over on my other screen. People enter all different words and phrases of what thriving communities look like to them. So keep going, audience, and if we have time and I can figure it out, I'll make sure to share that with everyone on screen when at the conclusion of our conversation today. So Kim, I'm going to stay with you for our first question. You talked about NLIHC's Out of Reach report. So tell us, according to NLIHC's amazing research, which we use here at the partnership, and I know countless folks who are attending the conference use regularly, what does the affordable housing crisis look like in Connecticut?
Yeah, great question. So like I said, NLIHC does, we do a lot of reports, but our two annual kind of seminal reports are Out of Reach, which looks at the cost of affordable housing, and The Gap, which looks at the availability of affordable rental housing based on income level. And so according to our data, there are over 89,000 there's an over 89,000 unit shortage of affordable rental homes available to extremely low income renters in the state of Connecticut. Nationally, that looks like about 7.3 million units that are not affordable and available, that are a shortage of 7.3 million units affordable and available to the lowest income renters. And in Connecticut, among extremely low income households, there are only 37 affordable and available rental homes per 100 renter households, which leaves about 73% of extremely low income households to struggle to afford the cost of rent. Our research also shows that as you move up the income ladder, that shortage gets less severe. So by the time we hit 100% of area median income, there are 101 affordable available rental units per 100 households. And sometimes when I'm having conversations with, Hill staff or other folks, that number, the idea that, the shortage gets less severe as you move up the income ladder, it strikes people as odd because so many people are hearing from, middle income households, from middle income families, I can't afford the cost of rent. So how can it be that there is an adequate number of affordable units for these households and still people are struggling to afford rent? That's because of the severe shortage at the extremely low income side of that spectrum. When there's an extreme shortage of rental housing stock for extremely low income people, those households are forced into units that are unaffordable to them, which puts pressure on the housing market that travels up the income spectrum. So now there are fewer units affordable to people who are very low income, fewer units affordable and available to people who are low income, and fewer units affordable and available to people who are middle income. And I think another important piece to mention too, when we're talking about kind of the full context of the affordable housing crisis, is that when people are spending so much money on rent, they can't afford other necessities like nutritious food or school supplies for their kids, let alone saving for a house or a down payment on a car or college education, any of those things that people save money for. And as a result, people are also often one missed paycheck or an unreimbursed medical bill or other unexpected expense away from falling behind on rent and facing eviction. So that is what we're looking at when we talk about kind of the broad context of the affordable housing crisis. I'll pass it back over to Chelsea now.
Thanks so much, Kim. And we'll make sure, I should have done this in advance, to pin, the 2 reports that you talked about into the session. And actually, maybe I can ask Danielle to do that for folks, if possible, while we're on the session. But so, we heard from Senator Blumenthal about the bipartisan concern and efforts from our Senate on housing. And so, Dennis, can you talk about the Bipartisan Policy Center's Executive Council for Housing Affordability and sort of why this bipartisan approach is crucial in addressing housing affordability issues?
Sure. Well, first of all, Kim raised some really important points about the lack of supply, and we're focused both on the renter side and the homeownership side, but the lack of supply has really impacted both segments of the housing market. And you look at the rental side, nearly 50% of the renters are housing cost burden, meaning they pay in excess of 30% of their income on housing costs, and nearly one in four, 25%, are severely cost burdened, meaning they pay in excess of 50% of their income just on housing. So we're hearing about housing unaffordability across the spectrum. It's affecting both red states and blue states, Republicans and Democrats. We have done polling recently with our partners, Morning Consult, showing that large bipartisan majorities think that Congress needs to act on housing affordability. So it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans as well. We have put together a piece of legislation. When Build Back Better collapsed, there's a huge amount of funding for housing programs in Build Back Better. We said we stepped back. There's a lot of distress in the housing community, and we said, look, there's a lot of bipartisanship on housing, and we see the housing affordability challenge through 3 lenses. The lack of supply as being really important. Secondly, the need to preserve our existing stock of affordable homes. And third, the need to help bridge the gap between incomes of households and housing costs through demand side supports like vouchers. And we looked at what was going on in Congress in all 3 of those lanes. We found a lot of significant ideas, a lot of significant initiatives that have strong bipartisan support. So we put those all together into a legislative package called the American Housing Act, which has supply, preservation, and demand side ideas in it, and have been urging Congress to look at this issue on a comprehensive way and to pass comprehensive legislation. That may not happen anytime soon, at least by the end of the year, but there are opportunities to take important pieces of that, like the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which has strong bipartisan support, unbelievable bipartisan support, to get that over the finish line, which would expand and strengthen the low-income housing tax credit program. And there is potentially an opportunity, I'm an optimist, by the end of the year through a tax extenders package to get that through. So let me just mention that. You asked specifically about the Executive Council for Housing Affordability. We feel that affordable housing is obviously shelter. It's obviously a basic necessity. It's also the platform for upward mobility for people. It's connected to health, mental and physical well-being, but it's also really important to the U.S. economy to have housing affordability in this country. So we have brought together a group of large and relatively small companies together in this Executive Council for Housing Affordability. One of them is Matrix Rental Solutions, which is based in Stamford, Connecticut. And our goal is to communicate to Congress to say, the goal of the Executive Council is to say, this is really important. Affordable housing is really important to corporate America. Affordable housing is really important to to economic growth and to the U.S. economy. So it's important for Congress to take action on a comprehensive basis to improve housing affordability in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And I appreciate you, picking up where Kim left off, and don't be boxed in by my questions. Take the conversation, have conversations with each other. I want to give you some starters, but you can take it and run with it. So Deborah, I want to get you in on this conversation because your work is centered around protecting the most vulnerable people in our communities. Can you talk a little bit more about your work and how federal and state laws protect vulnerable populations, our veterans, our elderly, folks with disabilities in the housing context, and sort of what measures you're working on or that can be taken to enhance these protections?
Sure, thanks so much. So I would add that sort of given the data that Kim presented around how many tenants are severely cost burdened nationwide, and in Connecticut alone, the fact that 49% of renters are at 50% below the area mean income or below. I think that tenant protections play a key role in all of this, and interventions for tenants are critical to ensuring housing stability here, in your state and nationwide. We know that a disproportionate number of renters are Black and Latinx families who experience extremely high rates of housing instability. And those families we know are just one paycheck away from being forced to choose between housing and food, medical care, and other needs. So we've seen communities across the country address eviction protections in a number of ways, eviction prevention, excuse me. And I'm going to talk about a few that we've seen as really successful tenant protections that have been implemented on a state and local level. And then I can talk a little bit too about a federal Bill of Rights. So we'd like to see sort of these protections implemented on a federal level so that everybody across the country, no matter what state they're in, are on even playing field. So I'm going to talk about 4 tenant protections, and I'll give some examples of some successful models. So first is pre-filing eviction diversion programs with access to emergency rental assistance. The second one is right to counsel and just cause evictions statewide. Tenant screening protections for rental debts, credit, and evictions, prior evictions, and then long-term housing supports that Dennis already mentioned, like housing choice vouchers. So one of the areas that we saw a lot of really incredible work being done during the pandemic is around eviction diversion programs. So we counseled with the National Center for State Courts, which I know some of you probably work with, to implement local programs in your area. So the key to eviction diversion programs is really to couple it with emergency rental assistance. And when I say eviction diversion programs, I mean these are mostly collaborations with courts and local governments and other stakeholders to intervene with an eviction before it's filed. And it's provide the necessary supports along with it. And that's where the emergency rental assistance comes into play. So these eviction diversion programs coupled with the rental assistance recognize that for some families, really these emergency supports are what is needed at that moment where the family is facing that housing instability. So Philadelphia has a really great model that we were working with advocates on during the pandemic. It was very successful. And again, you can get on the National Council of State Courts website, and you can see National Center for State Courts website, excuse me, and you can see examples of other really great eviction diversion programs pre-filing coupled with that emergency rental assistance. So the second tenant protection that I'll talk about that we've seen success with is good cause coupled with access to the right to counsel. So we know that nationwide, 3% of tenants are represented by an attorney, and that number goes up to 81% when you look at the number of landlords represented. And we know that in many cases, unrepresented tenants are faced with an eviction. So we now have some significant data showing the impacts of the right to counsel. New York City has a right to counsel program, and we're seeing the data come out there that's showing that many families are able to avoid homelessness with that right to counsel. But it's really important to note that we have to pair the right to counsel with just cause eviction laws, which prevent people from being unfairly evicted, right? So it said the landlord has to provide a reason for the eviction. And these two strategies really go hand in hand because you're addressing the inequities of the court system But also, giving families, there's a defense to that unlawful detainer, to that eviction. And so it's giving families and giving families an attorney and someone to enforce those local rights. So the third policy that I'll just highlight around tenant protections is strengthening restrictions on tenant screening. So we've seen a lot of really great innovation around that. We know the typical grounds for denial of rental housing include eviction judgments, criminal history, poor credit history. And we know that Black and Latinx families experience much higher rates of evictions, higher rates of arrests and convictions, and poor credit. And so they're oftentimes permanently barred from accessing affordable housing. And as a result, families end up in higher poverty neighborhoods. And so we've seen a number of innovations around this nationwide, where there's restrictions put on place with respect to tenant screening, and those have become a really important tool to expand housing access for families. So the fourth and last policy that I'll touch upon is longer-term housing supports, which Dennis mentioned is really a key bipartisan tool to support families. And this is really important with respect to when you think about emergency rental assistance. Emergency rental assistance works really well for families who are behind on 1 month's rent, for example, but their housing in the long term is sustainable. But we also need to couple that with things like housing choice vouchers, which we know work in the longer term for families whose families are want housing stability in the long term and perhaps are unable to afford the rising rents in any given community. So those are a number of policies that we've seen as successful nationwide around tenant protections and keeping families housed, which are a critical part of the affordable housing conversation.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive breakdown of those 4 protections. And, Connecticut has taken some significant steps on the first 3. We have some work to do around pairing right to counsel with good cause eviction and expanding good cause eviction here in Connecticut. But we've made some progress on the first 3 in the last couple of years and in our last legislative session. So just a reminder to our audience, I'm not sure that I said it, but there is a Q&A box at the bottom. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen that you can use to submit questions for the panelists. So I'll keep an eye on it. I'll work to integrate some of your questions for Deborah, Dennis, and Kim as we talk and see how many we can address at the end. But Dennis and Deborah, you both talked about vouchers. So let's talk about rental assistance and vouchers. We know that vouchers are highly effective at improving housing stability and economic opportunity for the families that they serve. Each of you talked about that. Here in Connecticut, we of course have HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. We also have a state-funded rental assistance program. And so both have long wait lists and serve substantially less households, as Kim mentioned, than those that are in need and that qualify. So how do we expand and reform housing voucher programs at the federal and state level to better stabilize housing for Connecticut families? Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I'll jump in, Chelsea, if that's okay. The Terwilliger Center BPC is strongly supportive of the voucher program. It's not perfect, but it's a program that has worked reasonably well since its creation. 15 years ago, the BPC had a housing commission, a blue ribbon housing commission, bipartisan, which supported the idea that we should transition to a system where every extremely low income household who is seeking a voucher can get access to that. Of course, as you know, only 1 in 4 families who might be eligible for a voucher get access to a voucher, and vouchers are often distributed by lottery. And when you get a voucher, it's often very hard to utilize because you can't find a suitable apartment. So it is a problem. We have decided we're not pushing the universal voucher at this point because it just is not that this is not the political environment for it. But we have, as part of our American Housing Act, we have support for the Family Stability and Opportunity Voucher Act, which is bipartisan, introduced in both the House and the Senate, that authorizes 250,000 new vouchers for households with very young children And it builds on the research of Raj Chetty and others who have shown that if a family has an opportunity to move into a community with greater opportunities with young children, that really has a profound impact on the life trajectory of those young children. So we're getting strongly behind. We are strongly behind that bill. We think that's a reasonable bipartisan approach right now. We're also supportive of, and I've worked with Kim on this, I believe, the Choice in Affordable Housing Act, which we need to get more landlords participating in the voucher program, particularly landlords who have properties in communities with opportunity. And so the Choice in Opportunity Act, which is bipartisan in both the House and the Senate as well, would provide, some administrative relief for landlords. Landlord give money to PHAs for landlord liaisons. It just is trying to make the experience for landlords a little easier in interacting with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So it's really important for all of us to put our heads together to figure out how do we get more landlords, particularly with properties in communities of opportunity, participating in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. But there is legislation that we think would move the needle significantly on that issue in Congress. So, and it's bipartisan, and we would love to see that get enacted.
I can jump in if that's right. So, there's 37,000 vouchers in Connecticut. And I agree with everything that Dennis said. And I think that there's a lot we can do, particularly to encourage more landlords to take those vouchers. But I also think there's a lot that HUD can do at the administrative level to ensure not just higher utilization rates, but also success rates. So what we're seeing across the country is that even where utilization rates are high for housing authorities, so they're getting close to 100% of their budget authority, families are churning through vouchers, right? So success rates are really low. For every 10 vouchers that are out in the community, maybe families are able to use 4. So one recommendation is to increase the subsidy amounts and require housing authorities to really hit closer to market rent, right? Until we do that on a local level, families will not be able to afford to live, particularly in areas of opportunity. And HUD has taken some really important steps, including, most importantly, the small area FMR program, which sets rents generally at closer to market. So in higher resource areas, the rents will be higher. They recently expanded the program, and there's, I believe the Connecticut, the Hartford metro area was included in the expansion. But we'd love to see even more housing authorities adopt small area FMRs voluntarily, and we'd love to see HUD lead on this, as they have with the expansion, but also in providing technical assistance and training to local housing authorities. And another thing I would just want to uplift is that, Connecticut has a source of income law, right? Source of income discrimination is prohibited throughout the state in California. And we've seen some really great levels around enforcement, which has proven to be a real challenge, not just here in Connecticut, but in communities across the country. So we'd love to see more of these partnerships. And again, we'd love to see HUD really supporting these partnerships. And we've been really pressing HUD to publish some guidance on this because we think that state and housing authorities have a role to play, and HUD can really be a leader in this space. So for example, here in California and Santa Monica, which has had a source of income law in the books for a really long time, there's a really excellent partnership between the city and legal aid. And the tenant will oftentimes come to the legal aid attorney and say, hey, this landlord's not accepting me because I have a voucher. And legal aid flags it for the city attorney, and the city attorney sends a very nice letter because, to Dennis's point, we don't want to scare landlords away from participating in the program, but explaining the law and saying it's illegal in Santa Monica to discriminate on this basis. And they have turned around almost every single voucher that has come through the door in this way. And so it's a really successful model, and one that, you know, we would love HUD to encourage more local communities to employ. The last recommendation I'll make on this is that we'd love to see HUD make it easier for the regional administration of the voucher program. There's a lot of challenges for voucher families moving between jurisdictions. There's you know, hundreds of housing authority. There's over 4,000 in the country. There's hundreds in almost hundreds in every state. And what that means for voucher families, it creates a lot of barriers to moving around, particularly to, you know, in some areas, there may not be a higher resourced neighborhood for a voucher tenant to move to. And so making it easier for voucher families to move across those jurisdictional lines, we would, you know, there's HUD really could go a long way in changing they're called formal consortium, but also there's a number of other ways that housing authorities can do it, and that HUD can support those housing authorities to take a more regional approach to the voucher program. And then I'm going to pass it to Kim, because my hunch is that she also has recommendations.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, so just to, you know, piggyback off of what was already said, Dennis, thank you so much for bringing up the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which presents a really exciting opportunity to expand the availability of housing vouchers. I think it's important to emphasize that currently this program is so underfunded that only 1 in 4 households income qualified to receive a voucher actually gets the help that they need. So that leaves the other 75% of people to continue struggling to afford the cost of rent. And because of that severe shortage, the wait list for a voucher in some communities, including DC, is around 20 years. I just spoke with a tenant a couple days ago who applied for a voucher when she was pregnant with her child and did not hear back from them until earlier this year. And her kid is now 20. So she waited 20 years to hear back from HUD about a housing voucher, which is an absurd wait time. So expanding the availability of those vouchers, whether through the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act or through an appropriations bill that can provide that additional funding to expand vouchers to more families, are going to be really, really important. In addition to kind of the state level source of income discrimination protections too that Deborah was talking about, NLIHC supports a federal ban on source of income discrimination. That would be in the Fair Housing Improvement Act, which we are big supporters of. And I think one other thing just to add is that throughout the pandemic, the emergency housing voucher model has provided a lot of really interesting and important lessons about how we can increase voucher uptake by increasing some of the flexibilities within the voucher program. And by mandating things like partnerships between continuums of care and PHAs in order to make sure that people most in need, including, of course, people experiencing homelessness, are connected to those voucher resources and can find that safe, stable housing with them.
Thank you all so much for touching on the lack of funding, the accessibility challenges, and so many of the barriers that we see on the federal level and on the state level to effective implementation of a program that we know, and a strategy that we know works, right? And we know that it houses people and stabilizes families quickly, because what we also know is that we have a dearth, that we haven't, we need more units of housing, but that takes a lot more time than families have. Families don't have 20 years to wait for access to safe, stable housing, especially our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness. So let's pivot a little bit to talk about supply a little bit more, and some promising solutions to enhance housing supply that you see nationally that you want to bring to Connecticut's attention. That's for anybody.
Well, let me just talk about, Chelsea, if I'll step in here, talk about the problem, the supply problem. Kim mentioned her organization's estimate, 7.3 million rental units is the shortfall. There are other organizations, Freddie Mac, Moody's, have also put out estimates. Up for Growth is another organization that has put out estimates, and they're in the millions as well. So I think the good news is in the sense that we all recognize that there's a supply shortage. There's a shortage of affordable rentals, and there's also a shortage of starter homes for sale. On the starter home side, let me just, one statistic that sort of has struck me is that in the late 1970s, we built about 420,000 starter homes annually. In 2021, we only built 62,000. So we're just not building enough capacity for the demand that's out there, and that has been a big contributor to the housing affordability problem. Is this mismatch between supply and demand? I think we need to pass the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. That would create nearly 2 million homes over the next 10 years. Not enough, but a really good start. We need to enact the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is a tax credit similar to the low-income housing tax credit that would incentivize private investment in the rehabilitation and construction of homes for sale in distressed communities, and it would be income-based for the people who could buy those homes. That would create 500,000 homes over the next 10 years. So you have 2.5 million homes over the next 10 years that these two tax proposals, which have bipartisan support in Congress, could achieve. We also, of course, as been mentioned earlier, need to have sort of this is basically a local effort, but local zoning regulations inhibit density, inhibit greater supply. So we need to encourage local communities that have taken action in that regard. And at the BPC, at the Terwilliger Center, if you go to our website, we've highlighted recently 8 local communities and states that have taken action to reform their local zoning and land use policies to improve housing affordability, to increase potentially the supply of affordable homes. Places like Buffalo, Grand Rapids, Michigan, the state of Nebraska. Utah, for example, is a state that has passed a law to encourage accessory dwelling units statewide. So state preemption is an approach where the state level laws preempt local policies is something that places like Nebraska and Utah and Oregon and even California have embraced. And there's another area that I think with potentially really good possibilities is new technologies in housing construction. There's sort of a boom now in 3D printing and offsite modular housing, manufactured housing. There's one company, Vessel Technologies, that has participated in our work that is building modular multifamily housing. So it's built in a factory and put together on site, which reduces costs and speeds up the timeline for construction. So which would improve housing affordability. So I think that's a space we really need to encourage and not get in the way of necessarily. New technologies, new construction techniques that can lower costs and improve housing affordability. So I'll leave it. I'll stop there. Talking too much, Chelsea.
No such thing. Kim or Deborah, anything to add?
Sure. I was going to jump in with a very new program at HUD and I should say I agree with all of what Dennis says, and there's a comment, I believe, in the Q&A about zoning, which plays a huge role certainly in production nationwide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a new HUD program, because I think it's a really important part of the conversation when we think about the number of severely rent burdened renters in Connecticut. But first I'm going to talk about the preservation tool, and then how HUD has really transformed it into a production tool. So we do at NHLP a lot of work on behalf of federally assisted residents and public housing residents in particular, who have been stigmatized and segregated for decades. And so in turn, what we've seen in the public housing context is disinvestment for years in the public housing program, resulting in a loss of an average 10,000 public housing units a year. And we've actually cut the public housing stock essentially in half nationwide. And important to remember that this is deeply subsidized housing for in the poorest families in this country, and in most cases, it's the only affordable housing in a given community. So part of this, on top of the disinvestment, historically, part of the loss has been a result of HUD's policies around the demolition and disposition of public housing, which don't provide for replacement of that housing, and they don't provide for any tenant protection. So with the loss of the housing also comes the displacement of these majority minority households. So in 2011, the rental assistance demonstration was created, and one of the reasons it was created was to address in part this severe loss of deeply affordable housing. And basically we call it RAD, but RAD created a mechanism by which housing authorities could convert their public housing to different forms of subsidies that were more sustainable in the long term, right? So sort of Congress, because of the disinvestment by Congress, it was a new way for local communities to invest in this housing in the long term and protect the tenants. So the program itself is a real success story that I like to uplift in part because of the resident engagement. So our organization, my predecessor at NHLP, actually worked with the residents, and then HUD Secretary Sean Donovan brought the residents to the table in DC to help craft the RAD program. And that's the reason we see such important tenant protections and long-term investments in that on paper in that program itself. So fast forward now, part of our job is to make sure the program is implemented properly. So part of what we do is kind of monitor the preservation of those public housing properties as they convert to other subsidies. So the reason I'm bringing up RAD is because there's a new feature in RAD called Fair Cloth to RAD. So some of you may know that one of the reasons we don't have any new public housing in the country is via a 1999 amendment called the Fair Cloth Amendment. And what that did in Congress was cap the number of public housing units at the 1999 levels. So we don't see any new funding. We don't see any these deeply subsidized units, public units, because of this Fair Cloth to RAD, because of the RAD limit, the Fair Cloth limit. And so given the loss every year, we see the numbers of the deeply subsidized units decreasing. So what Fair Cloth to RAD does is provide cities, housing authorities, communities, a new way to finance these units and basically provide pre-approval to public housing units and immediately convert the property to these long-term project-based Section 8 properties, which provide tenant protections and long-term preservation assurances. So what we're doing is allowing communities to build back to their Fair Cloth limits in public housing. So HUD has some great resources on its website on this, and it also is a list of the housing authorities with over 1,000 Fair Cloth units available. So in Connecticut, the city of Hartford has 1,655 units that it could build towards its Fair Cloth limits, and that is deeply affordable housing for its residents. And then New Haven is another city on the list that has 1,100 units. So I think I just want to highlight this because, again, we oftentimes at NHLP ask ourselves, affordable housing, affordable for who? This is a really important new tool to build deeply subsidized housing for poor families.
Thank you so much, Deborah. and providing the Connecticut specific examples too. We really appreciate that. I'm looking at time, and Kim, I feel like I want to get you into the conversation more, and maybe you can talk about any other federal resources that are available to Connecticut to preserve existing affordable housing units, and talk about sort of the turnover of affordable units and how we can better prevent displacement of low-income residents.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the key tools to preventing displacement is goes back to a lot of what Deborah was talking about earlier, which is renter protections, ensuring that tenants have adequate legal representation in eviction, that they can avoid eviction court, creating something like a permanent emergency rental assistance program that is funded and provided adequate funding. We know from the pandemic that emergency rental assistance has been a really crucial tool in keeping people stably housed, even as the cost of rent goes up. And as communities run out of that funding, we're seeing more and more households facing eviction and displacement, and in worst cases, homelessness. So creating a program that will provide that long-term or provide that funding for people is going to be really crucial, as well as implementing state and federal and local tenant protections to ensure people are not displaced. That can include something like rent control or rent stabilization measures that dictate how much and how often the price of rent can increase in order to ensure people aren't facing, these outrageous increases in the cost of rent that we've seen around the country over the past year. And I also just wanted to take a minute to talk about the need for continued investments in public housing. So like Deborah said, public housing provides a really crucial resource, deeply income targeted, affordable housing for people with the lowest incomes. Unfortunately, we have largely left public housing to disrepair. And that's, the fault of the federal government, to be honest, right? If I buy a house and I put no money towards its upkeep, it's going to start falling apart. And similarly, without the funding necessary to upkeep the nation's vital public housing stock, that stock has started to fall apart. There's at least a $70 billion capital needs public backlog. Dennis mentioned the Build Back Better Act earlier, RIP. Still keeps me up at night sometimes, but we did secure $70 billion of funding for public housing in that bill. That would have been really, game changing for a lot of communities in preserving that affordable housing stock. But hope springs eternal, and we're going to continue showing up and asking for that investment. We're also seeing some movement towards community land trust, in which, community members actually own the land on which housing is built, which can help with long-term affordability measures. And I just wanted to highlight a new grant program from HUD, the Pro Housing Grant, which is meant to incentivize communities to take up some of those local zoning reforms in order to facilitate the construction of more affordable housing.
Thanks so much, Kim. I've been scanning the questions, feeling like the time is closing in on us with all the great questions that folks are asking. But definitely, you all have touched on zoning, and there's been some comments and questions around sort of what do we do around zoning. I see from one, new technologies, I think that Dennis, you were mentioning, have not been easy to adapt here in Connecticut because of zoning. How do we move the needle here on zoning? And then a couple of comments around rent control, which Kim, you just talked about, right? So someone asked, or someone shared that last session here in Connecticut, we heard from a large number of people that testified in support of, in Connecticut, what was known as cap the rent legislation. And the idea didn't pass, but moving forward, we're considering creating a tenant advocate position similar to the one, the tenant advocate office in Washington, D.C. Any thoughts from the panel? And I see, how can you justify rent control in areas where taxes and costs of living go up so much each year? So any other sort of thoughts on rent control as a policy and what's happening in other communities?
So I can jump in on this. I mean, I live in California, where we now have statewide rent stabilization. And I will say, we think rent stabilization is a very important tool to keeping rental homes affordable. But one impact that I will say that we did not anticipate is the proliferation of junk fees now, which is certainly happening nationwide, and we're really pleased to see federal agencies addressing this issue. And the Biden administration also really giving this issue the attention it deserves, because this is a national issue. But because of our rent stabilization in California, I will say one unanticipated outcome has been we're seeing all kinds of junk fees, because rent is not defined, and what is rent may be different in every local community. And so there are some challenges around that here in California, but overwhelmingly, I mean, there are cities in California that have had rent stabilization laws on the books for a long time, and we've seen really positive outcomes overall.
I think Deborah brings up a really important point too about rent stabilization being one tool of many that should be at least considered, if not implemented. The fact is, the best solutions for communities are going to vary in some way based on the specific needs of those communities. And so I also think it's important to ensure that as people talk through solutions to the affordable housing crisis, they're including the voices of people that are most impacted by those decisions, and ensuring that they're really centering the needs of directly impacted people in their policymaking.
Dennis, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, we at the Terwilliger Center have not taken a position on rent control. As you can imagine, there's some strongly held views opposed to it. We had you could go to our website, bipartisan.org, housing, and you could find where we had 5 advocates of rent control and 5 opponents flesh out all the arguments. I mean, the argument against rent control, of course, and one of the primary arguments is that it is a disincentive for more supply. Builders will not build more if their rents are subject to control. So the rents that they can charge are subject to some sort of control. So we just haven't taken a position on the issue at the BPC.
Thanks, Dennis. So we definitely have more questions in the question box than we will have time for today. But what I've done and I've committed to in other sessions is pulling the unanswered questions, sending them to the panel, and at least sharing back the answers with the folks who asked them if you did not submit it anonymously. So thank you for your patience as we get through things. But with just a couple of minutes left, I like to do that sort of traditional panel thing of the round robin of if you could only choose one, because we've talked about a bevy, right? And we know that this is a bad question because it doesn't just take one. But what's your one that your top housing policy priority, for the next year, 2 years? You pick the time frame and why.
I would say for the next 2 months or for next 6 weeks, pass the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that has tremendous bipartisan support. 200 members of the House, I think, close to that, have endorsed it. So let's get that over the finish line. There's talk about a tax extenders package. Let's get this bill passed. We talk about the housing affordability crisis. Well, this is something that's right in front of us that can be done and could have a significant impact. So let's do it.
Thought you were going to say pass a budget.
Well, that's a different issue.
So I'll go ahead. I mentioned this briefly in my during the initial response, but federal tenants' bill of rights. We would love to see all tenants in this country have a basic level of protections. We want to create a floor. It varies so much right now by state and even locality. And we know that renter protections and eviction prevention is critical to ensuring housing stability nationwide, and frankly, to even begin address the systemic racism embedded in our housing system. So I would say federal tenants' bill of rights with components like written rental agreements, a prohibition on unreasonable rent terms, enforced habitability, tenant privacy rights, and, protections like opportunity to cure in the case of non-payment of rent. But we'd love to see that on a federal level, and NHLP is working on it. But I would say it's not the more of the 5-year plan.
In addition to both both of the priorities that Deborah and Dennis laid out, because NLHC would love to see both of the Tenants Bill of Rights passed and, of course, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act enacted. Perhaps in the short term, it's obvious to say we want to see those appropriations bills finalized. We want to see increased funding for HUD's affordable housing and homelessness programs. I will say that advocates have done such a tremendous job, and especially appropriations ranking member Rosa DeLauro, who is from Connecticut, has done such a fantastic job in defending so many HUD programs from drastic cuts at a time when we were looking at some right-wing members of the House proposing cuts of up to 30% to some programs. We actually saw some funding increases to HUD, although of course also cutting of some important programs like the home program. All of that is to say we want to see those bills finalized and passed to make sure that we don't have any lapse in appropriated funding or any government shutdown or a long-term continuing resolution. In the longer term, I would also love to see a significant expansion of housing choice vouchers. Big picture, we want to see that made into a mandatory program so that every household who needs assistance actually receives it, and nobody's paying more than 30% of their rent or income on their rent. But that is a long-term push that we are going to continue fighting for.
Great. Thank you all so much. All right, I'm going to try to, as we close out, share back. I mentioned, someone asked if all of the answers to all of the questions could be shared with everyone to have some more transparency around that. So we can absolutely do that. It's not meant to be not transparent. So we'll do our best to do that. And we'll also share with you your answers here on what words or phrases describe what thriving communities look like to you. And so some of the biggest words in this word cloud are affordable, diverse, and inclusive, which I think we talked about lots of policies that can, on the federal level, get us a lot closer to that here in Connecticut and beyond. So we'll share that out with folks as well. But with just a few minutes to spare, I wanted to thank each of you so much for your time and for this conversation. We're really pleased to have your expertise and your leadership. And I know that I learned a ton from this conversation. I hope my typing wasn't distracting to folks as I'm trying to take notes. I learned so much. And thank you, Dennis, Deborah, and Kim. I see lots of audience hearts and claps for you as well. We really appreciate you. So we will take a quick lunch break, and at 12 p.m. we'll hear from some of our state policy leaders. So we'll see you back on Zoom then. Replenish your body, and we'll return back in just half an hour. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.